Okay, hello everybody, it's Mr. Mallon. One of the things that I'm sorry we're missing out on this spring is the seasonal change in a vernal pool. So I will be attempting to take you virtually to several vernal pools starting today. This one is in Chester, New York, kind of near Frozen Ropes, if you've ever been there for baseball or softball training. And the habitat here is a bottomland swamp forest. It's a wetland, but it's heavily wooded, which means in a matter of weeks, it's March 27th today, in a matter of weeks that canopy is going to close in with leaves and this will become much shadier. One of the key ideas concerning vernal pools is they are relatively small. It's not necessarily a requirement, but a pond that's much larger than this, and I'm looking at maybe 50 feet across, which I believe is the figure in our notes. A pond much larger than this is likely to be permanent and not temporary or ephemeral. So I'm waiting out here. It's a place where I've heard wood frogs and spring peepers calling. The spring peepers won't leave big egg masses, but the wood frogs do. And so you can see perhaps the water is kind of cloudy, stagnant. It doesn't make you want to take a drink. But this is essentially just runoff from the surrounding higher ground. And you can see there's plants, various twigs of shrubs sticking out, and those furnish sites of attachment for the wood frog egg masses. The water's still pretty cold, and coming in here, also the breeding should be more or less over with, but coming in here, the frogs, if they were calling, would be quieting down, and they sense the approach of people or other animals. So I've come upon the cluster of egg masses, and I don't know how well this is going to show on my video, but just for scale, here is one egg mass. So this would be probably the bulk of the output from one frog. You can see the egg mass is already green with algae, and that's thought to be a bit of a symbiotic relationship in that the algae are producers carrying out photosynthesis, and the oxygen they produce will help those developing wood frog embryos, particularly as the temperature rises. The dissolved oxygen in a stagnant body of water like this can drop dangerously low, and so the algae are providing some oxygen. In return, the nitrogen wastes of the and the carbon dioxide waste of the developing embryos should be beneficial to the algae. Anyway, if I zoom back by basically standing up, you can see this is entirely massive cluster of egg masses, several, maybe 3 dozen egg masses, and you can do the math, but we're talking about over 1,000 embryos easily in this area. The area of the frame with the shadow running across the middle is about 5 feet, 5 feet in diameter. Let me zoom back in. There's something pretty interesting here if I don't bring in too much mud. So center frame looks like a random assortment of twigs, but let's keep our eye on that. And you'll see that it's moving. So this is not a random assortment of twigs, but rather it's a case. You see right at the... Okay, so just to continue that thought, you can see these are almost perfectly spherical, so that would be freshly laid eggs, and I will keep these in a separate container so we'll be able to watch them develop and elongate. By the way, something I forgot to mention, if we go back over here to the egg masses in place, any of those, see that white cloudy thing in the middle of the frame? Not the pinkish piece of red maple flower, but the white. And then here's another one over here. Those would represent eggs that failed to develop properly, and so they're dead embryos. They're beginning to decompose, and we see them as white features. Still, if we look at the big picture, there aren't too many of those, and if many of these egg masses are 200 to 300 eggs per egg mass, the number of successful tadpoles in this pool overall will be in the many thousands in a couple of months. Okay, just to continue the thought about these caddisfly larvae, here's one in my hand. Here's another one in a little container I brought along to view. So they really don't look like an insect. They look like a sort of a random cluster of plant material. And they're going to be detritus feeders crawling around the vernal pool, obviously super camouflaged before they metamorphose and someday fly away. And speaking of that, the concept of a vernal pool food chain is important to us. You can see there's not a lot of green plant material here. There's the algae and the egg mass, as we noted before, but most of the food webs are going to be based on detritus at the outset. As the spring advances, we'll see algae moving in here for creatures to start feeding on. Next, I'll move to another vernal pool where we'll look for marbled salamander larvae. That would be the one type of salamander, around here at least, that has already laid his eggs in the fall. Those eggs should have hatched by now into larvae sometime late last fall. Those larvae would be many months ahead of the wood frog tadpoles and the spotted salamander larvae in terms of their development. So they'll be predators on the other species of amphibians. Okay, so I've arrived at a second vernal pool. You see this big fallen tree, and then in the foreground the pool has that similar sort of murky looking quality to the water. Ooh. That's a pair of wood ducks that I didn't realize were there, but they flew away, and that's the distinctive voice of a flying wood duck. At any rate, I'm closing in now on the great mass of eggs here, similar to in the last pool. Hey guys, here I see many more failed eggs. Maybe they're just not fertilized, but there's a fallen tree crossing the larger fallen tree. This one is a red maple that's still alive. You can see the red flowers there, center frame. So this is fallen recently. There's still some life in it. And then at the base where the branches go into the water are the points of attachment for many of these wood frog egg masses. Again, the number is going to be in the thousands, but we can see from the white spots, particularly there, those will not be successful. And at this point, it's so early, they're probably just not fertilized, so they're already beginning to decompose. Okay, I'm going to cut off and rejoin if I can find a marbled salamander larvae or some other part of this community. So here's something of interest. I'm still at the same vernal pool. Haven't turned up any marbled salamander larvae. I did find a dragonfly nymph, but I lost it before I could show it to you. This is, of course, a crayfish. Not common in these waters here. Whoops. And there he goes. But one of the detritivores, a shredder of leaves and a scavenger, where the dragonfly nymph, maybe we'll find one later, would be one of the predators on other small invertebrates mainly. So there are predators here. There are water bugs, giant water bugs, diving beetles, predaceous diving beetles. What's missing, of course, are fish. And in that way, it makes it a little bit more of a safe haven for amphibians to lay their eggs. Here in a little sheltered nook of this vernal pool with the big fallen tree, it's warmer and shallow, and there's a lot of algae here, so this will be the beginning of the spring algal bloom, which will provide the basis for lots of food chains among the invertebrates and then the vertebrates in this ecosystem. Okay, so this is our third vernal pool today. This one is, you can almost say artificial in a way, in that if I continue to pan to my left, looking down the railroad tracks, and what you've got is the mounded up roadway for the railroad, and then alongside the ditch where that material was dredged from to build up that railroad. So this makes a very low spot, and you can see a old utility pole sticking out of the ground there, not hooked up to anything any longer. So yeah, let's take a look. I see some ripples on the surface, which indicates that there are still some amphibians in here, at least spring peepers, if not something a little larger. All right, closing in, here's another large mass of many wood frog egg masses. These are pretty advanced in the growth of algae. Then again, this is a much sunnier spot. This is not under the canopy of the forest. It's going to get full sunlight from about 1 o'clock in the afternoon onward. And coming around, here's the difference between the initial batches of eggs that were laid over a week ago, about 2 weeks ago, wood frogs were calling here, and then a freshly laid egg mass. Let me get my shadow out of that picture, and then you see the completely spherical jet black eggs of the wood frog. So one of the issues I wanted to bring up, it's not really relevant for this pool. This is alongside a railroad right away. The forest beyond this bottomland forest is in what's called a conservation easement, so it's not going to be developed. But one of our concerns with vernal pools is that, being as small as they are, they don't appear as designated wetlands on maps. They're often completely dry, and although this one's pretty deep, and it would be quite obvious to us, let's say at the end of August, even if it was bone dry, that something had been, that it had been inundated, saturated with water for most of the year. It is possible with smaller vernal pools that they're completely overlooked when they're dry in, say, August and September, and therefore maybe a low spot on a piece of property that's going to be developed, and they get filled in, and that habitat then is lost, and all the amphibians who migrate to this local vernal pool from maybe up to a kilometer or so away, they are pretty rigid in their behavior. I mean, they're adaptable, of course, but if this is the only vernal pool within a mile or so, that whole community of amphibians that are vernal pool dependent, wood frogs, spotted salamanders, marbled salamanders, may cease to breed and then gradually die out as a few years go by and they live out their natural lifespan without leaving any offspring behind. So it's important to understand how to recognize a vernal pool in the off season when they're dry to prevent them from being developed. Okay guys, last stop. This is a very small body of water. There's a little bit of a flow through it, but it's another low spot created by the railroad tracks, and I see some egg masses. I was here the other day and saw some of those case-building caddisfly larvae, and it's also at times utilized by spotted turtles, one of our species of special concern in New York. Not quite threatened, but probably should be considered threatened here. So here we go. Thought I'd show my face on camera so confirm that I'm out here. And so here we have a couple of wood frog egg masses not doing too well. Here's one of those case builder caddisfly larvae. I'll zoom in and you'll see him moving there. Really kind of bizarre. And yeah, so this is a very small pool. Maybe, let's see, that's fully zoomed out. From there to here, 6 to 8 feet, extremely shallow. I would consider this a risky place compared to those large pools we were just viewing, in which to lay your eggs, because the risk being the possibility that the pool completely dries out before the eggs have a chance to metamorphose. So I'm trying to reach a different type of case builder caddisfly larvae. Sorry for the shoddy camera work, but so there, get that leaf out of the way. So here's one I referred to earlier. It looks a little bit cigar-like, perhaps, and it's kind of flat-sided. Let me see if I can it would look better in the shadow. Nope. No, sunlight. So you can see it's tubular. It looks like a stick. But if you turn it this way, it's hollow, and the caddisfly larvae is actually inside there. So I've disturbed him enough. I'll let him go back to his business. Yeah, so this might be a poor choice. Amphibians in their breeding frenzy, they sometimes do that. Lay their eggs in a roadside puddle that you can guarantee will dry up. Panning forward, we'll move down the tracks here, but you can see there's more water. This is all highly susceptible to drying out in the summer. Just one point in closing. As I pan along the edge of the railroad tracks in yet another pool, the number of eggs that we saw today, not egg masses, but eggs, is probably in the neighborhood of, gosh, that's even hard to guess. I shouldn't have brought it up, but more than 50,000 I think is reasonable. And so it brings up the idea that these are what are called R-selected animals. I'm going to zoom in. There's some that are beginning to twitch in their little jelly cocoon, and they'll be swimming around as tadpoles soon. But R-selected means a species which produces large numbers of offspring. Typically there's no parental care, and the chance for survival is really low. So imagine if even 1% of these were to survive to adulthood. That would be an incredible number of wood frogs. So if we saw, I think 50,000 is a very low estimate today, but that would be 500 adult frogs hopping around in addition to the parental generation. And we know that that's not the case. The population is more or less stable from year to year. There are ups and downs depending on weather conditions. For example, a severe drought might take out a large percentage of this year's age class, and if that happened a couple of years in a row, the population could get very low, dangerously low. But we know the population is relatively stable year to year for this species, while other amphibians may be declining for reasons we haven't learned about yet. Wood frogs are doing okay around here. And the stability of the population tells us that far less than 1% of these are going to survive to adulthood. Female laying, let's say, 200 to 300 eggs in a given season, and surviving for at least 2 to 3 reproductive years if she's lucky. Pardon my camera work here. And so she's putting out perhaps 1,000 eggs, 600 to 1,000 eggs conservatively. And out of those, if the population is going to remain stable and she replaces herself and her mate as adults, that would be 2 surviving out of that vast number. So 2 out of 100 would be 2%. 2 out of 1,000 would be 0.2%. Not very good odds. So these guys don't have the brightest future, but a couple of them are going to make it, and they're going to survive to adulthood, and the wood frog population, barring anything unfortunate, should continue. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up here. I'll attach a couple of audio clips of other wetlands, and so you can see what the species sound like. For today, I think the main ideas have been relating to the incredible abundance of egg production by wood frogs, the rapid rate of development, which I may not have mentioned, but we can clearly see from eggs that are completely round and undeveloped like these guys, and some that are already twitching and ready to come out of their gelatin individual egg membranes. We've seen a little bit of the diversity, not too much, but lots of caddisfly, case builder larvae. I did see a dragonfly nymph, which I didn't manage to hold on to for the camera. Crayfish. I was hoping in this particular area to come up with a spotted turtle, which are alleged to sometimes prey on the egg masses. Talked a little bit about the beginnings of food chains, starting mainly with detritus, later on the season beginning with algae. This is a plant-filled sort of a pool here, so you can have lots of straight-up herbivores at the base of the food chain here. And I also just brought up the vulnerability to development, and by development I mean either draining to get the water out of here or filling it with dirt, with rocks, to bring it up to a higher elevation. And so the land becomes dry, and to develop it would be, for example, to flatten this out, fill it in, and put a house here. That would be an example of development. So while we certainly need that kind of economic activity, these vernal pools are unusual habitats. Their inhabitants are uniquely dependent on this specific type of environment, and so they need to be protected wherever possible from that kind of activity. Okay, thank you for your attention. Have a great day.